Late autumn, 1943. Northern France, still under German occupation. The countryside is quiet in a way that only occupied places become. Roads are watched, rail lines are guarded, even small movements attract attention. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a temporary German holding camp operates without ceremony. No banners, no speeches, just wire, sentries, and routine. Inside, among British and French prisoners, is an American airman, shot down weeks earlier during a daylight bombing raid over industrial targets in the Reich. He is no longer in the air war. He is no longer part of a formation. He is now a logistical problem, processed, counted, and assigned. Outside the camp, civilian life continues under restriction. Food is scarce. Travel is monitored. Assistance to prisoners is punishable by imprisonment or death. German notices make this clear. A woman passes near the perimeter on a regular basis, not as a visitor, not as a guard, as part of the surrounding civilian flow that occupation authorities rely on but never fully control. She carries nothing unusual. She says little. At first there is no plan, only observation. And in wartime Europe, observation is often how history quietly begins. The circumstances that brought them into the same place were shaped by a much larger war already in motion. A war that explains why helping a single American prisoner would soon carry consequences far beyond one life. By 1943, the war in Europe had entered a new phase. The United States Army Air Forces were conducting sustained daylight bombing campaigns over occupied Europe and Germany itself. American strategy relied on massed formations of heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s, flying deep into hostile airspace, with the expectation that defensive firepower and fighter escorts would limit losses. In practice, losses were severe. Raids over industrial regions in Germany and occupied France regularly resulted in damaged aircraft forced to turn back alone. When a bomber could not reach the channel or neutral territory, crews bilayed out over enemy-controlled land. Survival did not mean freedom. It meant capture. American airmen who parachuted into occupied France were typically detained first by local German units, then transferred to temporary holding facilities. From there, most were sent to permanent Luftwaffe-run camps in Germany, such as Stalag Luft III. But before that transfer occurred, many passed through smaller, lightly documented camps or labor detachments closer to where they were captured. These interim sites were vulnerable. They were often understaffed. Guard routines varied. Prisoners were moved frequently to avoid Allied intelligence tracking. For resistance networks, these moments before a POW vanished into the German system represented the narrowest window of opportunity. For the captured American, the transition was disorienting. One day he was part of a crew. The next, alone, stripped of equipment, questioned, registered, issued a number. International law protected him in theory, but only if he remained within the formal camp system. Outside those wires, however, the rules changed. German occupation authorities relied heavily on local labor, civilian transport, and coerced cooperation to keep these temporary facilities operating. Civilians cleaned, delivered food, repaired infrastructure. This dependence created cracks in control, cracks that resistance organizations quietly studied. By late 1943, Allied intelligence estimated that thousands of downed airmen were moving through occupied Europe each month. Most would be sent east. A small number would disappear before that happened. Those disappearances did not occur by chance. They were the result of a growing, coordinated effort by underground networks, and the effort increasingly depended on civilians willing to act long before escape became visible. The American prisoner did not yet know it, but the war around him had already created the conditions that made assistance possible, and those conditions were shaped by people operating in plain sight. By the time American airmen were being captured across occupied Western Europe, German control depended as much on intimidation as on manpower. France, Belgium, and parts of the Netherlands were governed through a layered system of military command, local collaboration, and constant surveillance. Public order was enforced through patrols, checkpoints, curfews, and a steady flow of printed warnings. One warning appeared everywhere: assisting escaped prisoners of war was a capital offense. Despite this, resistance networks expanded throughout 1942 and 1943. Some were politically motivated. Others were pragmatic, focused on intelligence collection, sabotage, or the movement of people. Helping Allied airmen became one of their most dangerous tasks, not because it was rare, but because it left a visible trail. Women played a central role in these networks. This was not accidental. German security forces often viewed women as less threatening, particularly those performing routine civilian labor. Couriers, food suppliers, cleaners, and transport assistants could move in restricted areas with fewer questions, though never without risk. Female resistance participants carried forged documents, memorized safe routes, and coordinated temporary shelters. Many did not know the full structure of the networks they served. This compartmentalization limited damage if one person was arrested. It also meant that decisions were often made quickly, without guarantees of protection. When an American POW was identified near a temporary holding site, the choice to help was immediate and irreversible. Once assistance began, an extra ration passed quietly, a message relayed, a route described, withdrawal became impossible. German counterintelligence, particularly the Gestapo and Abwehr, monitored areas around POW facilities precisely because escapes were expected. Punishments were not theoretical. Records show that civilians caught aiding escaped prisoners were imprisoned, deported, or executed. Entire families could be punished. Communities were sometimes fined or placed under curfew. And yet help continued. The woman near the camp was not acting on impulse. She was part of a pattern repeated across occupied Europe, civilians responding to the presence of Allied prisoners before formal plans could be established. These early acts of assistance did not always lead to escape, but they built trust. Trust that would soon matter, as the American prisoner's status shifted from guarded captive to something far more dangerous: a man who might attempt to disappear. That transition, once made, would force both of them into a moment where hesitation no longer existed. By early 1944, the American prisoner's situation had changed in subtle but important ways. He was no longer considered a short-term detainee. Paperwork had begun for his transfer east, deeper into the German POW system, where escape would become far more difficult. For resistance networks, this moment marked a deadline. Temporary holding sites were the last places where movement could be influenced. The camp's routine followed a predictable rhythm: roll calls at dawn and dusk, limited labor details outside the wire, guards rotated on fixed schedules. These patterns were not secrets, they were necessities of occupation. Resistance networks relied on civilians who observed these routines daily, not as spies in uniform, but as people cleaning floors, delivering supplies, repairing fences. The woman had already passed food. That alone placed her at risk. Now the question was whether the risk would escalate. Escape plans for Allied airmen rarely began with tunnels or violence. They began with timing, identifying when a prisoner could be removed from the system without triggering immediate alarms. Labor details offered that chance. Small groups escorted beyond the main perimeter, often by older or less alert guards, created moments where attention could lapse. On the selected morning, nothing outwardly changed. The prisoner joined a work party under guard. Civilian traffic moved along nearby roads. German patrols followed their usual routes. Any deviation would have drawn attention. At a prearranged point chosen not for concealment but for normalcy, the American was separated from the group. No running, No confrontation. He moved as civilians moved, guided not by speed but by invisibility. What followed was not freedom, it was disappearance. Within hours, German records would list him as missing. Patrols would expand. Interrogations would follow. The holding camp would tighten procedures. Every civilian previously near the prisoner would come under suspicion. For the woman, there was no longer a distinction between assistance and commitment. The escape, once executed, bound her fate to his. If he was found, the trail would be traced backward. The American, now outside the wire, carried no weapon, no uniform, no protection under international law. Survival depended entirely on the network that had chosen to act. And from this point forward, the danger no longer came from the camp behind them, but from the territory ahead. The absence was discovered during the next count. It was not immediate and it was not chaotic. German procedures emphasized control, not reaction. Names were checked, numbers confirmed. Only then did the realization settle that one prisoner had not returned. The response followed established protocol. Guards were questioned, routes were reviewed, local patrols were alerted, notices were prepared. The assumption was not that the prisoner had fled alone, but that assistance had been provided. In occupied Europe, escapes rarely occurred without civilian help. Search efforts focused outward. Roads were checked. Rail stations monitored. Civilians in the vicinity of the holding site were questioned, beginning with those who had regular access. This included workers, suppliers, and maintenance personnel. The American was already gone. For the next phase, survival depended on concealment rather than movement. Resistance doctrine emphasized short distances, frequent stops, and the avoidance of patterns. Safe locations were rarely ideal. Barn lofts, storage rooms, unused cellars, and abandoned outbuildings were used because they attracted no attention. Comfort was irrelevant. The woman's role shifted. Before the escape, she was a point of contact. After it, she became a guide and intermediary. Her knowledge of patrol routines, local customs, and civilian behavior was more valuable than any map. Contact was limited. Prolonged association increased risk. In many documented cases, helpers and escapees avoided being seen together in daylight. Supplies were passed indirectly. Instructions were memorized, not written. The American airman remained in civilian clothing. His accent, posture, and lack of familiarity with local behavior were liabilities. Movement occurred primarily at night or during periods of increased civilian traffic, when individual identities blurred. German countermeasures intensified. Escaped Allied airmen were considered intelligence risks. Notices were posted offering rewards for information. In some regions, collective punishment was threatened. Despite this pressure, the escape did not collapse. It held because it was never centered on speed or distance. It was centered on patience. Weeks passed. The American did not attempt to reach Allied lines directly. That would come later through established evacuation routes or during liberation. For now, the objective was simple: remain unseen. During this period, proximity created familiarity. Familiarity created reliance. What developed between them was not formed in privacy or peace, but under constant calculation: how long to stay, when to move, who could be trusted. The war, which had brought them together through chance and necessity, now pressed inward, shaping every decision they made together. Decisions that would only gain meaning once the larger conflict finally reached their region. By the spring and summer of 1944, the balance of power in Western Europe began to shift. Allied forces landed in Normandy in June, and although liberation did not arrive everywhere at once, German authority across occupied regions started to fracture. Rail movements became unreliable. Patrols thinned. Command structures grew strained under constant pressure from advancing armies and internal resistance activity. For civilians sheltering escaped Allied airmen, This period was paradoxically one of heightened danger. German forces, anticipating withdrawal, often intensified reprisals. Escaped prisoners who had survived months in hiding now faced the risk of exposure during chaotic retreats. The American airmen remained concealed as front lines moved closer. Resistance networks monitored Allied advances carefully, knowing that premature movement could be fatal. Liberation was not a single moment. It unfolded unevenly, village by village, road by road. When Allied troops finally entered the area, the transition was controlled. Resistance members identified themselves. Safe houses were cleared. Hidden personnel were brought forward cautiously, often after confirmation of unit identities and insignia. Mistakes could still cost lives. For the American, emergence from hiding did not mark an immediate return to freedom. Allied command procedures required medical evaluation, intelligence debriefing, and verification of identity. Escaped POWs were questioned about German facilities, troop movements, and security routines. Their survival stories became part of a much larger intelligence picture. Repatriation followed established channels. American airmen were transported to reception centers, processed, and eventually returned to Britain or directly to the United States. The system moved efficiently, but impersonally. Individual circumstances mattered less than restoring men to operational or civilian status as quickly as possible. This process created an abrupt separation. The woman who had helped him disappear returned to civilian life under altered conditions. Liberation did not erase suspicion overnight. In some regions, collaborators were punished publicly. Resistance members were questioned, documented, and in some cases formally recognized, though many received no acknowledgement at all. Their work had been clandestine by design. Communication between them became uncertain. Wartime secrecy had not encouraged the exchange of names or addresses. In documented cases, many Allied airmen left Europe without knowing how to locate the people who had saved them. Some believed they never would. Others tried. Letters were written through military channels, the Red Cross, or resistance associations. Some were returned unanswered. Some arrived months later. In a few cases, contact was re-established only years after the war ended. For the American veteran, survival carried a complicated weight. He had lived when others had not. He returned home with a story that could not easily be told, one that involved civilians who had risked everything, without uniforms or recognition. For the woman, the war ended without closure. She had acted during a period when choices were immediate and consequences absolute. Peace offered no clear framework for what those choices meant afterward. Their connection, formed under occupation and maintained through concealment, now faced a world governed by borders, paperwork, and distance. Forces far less dramatic than war, but often just as final. Those forces would determine whether the bond created in hiding could survive into peacetime. In the years immediately following the war, the paths of former Allied servicemen and European civilians rarely crossed again by chance. The machinery of demobilization moved millions of men back to their home countries with efficiency, but little regard for personal attachments formed under occupation. For American veterans, return meant rapid reintegration into civilian life, education programs, and employment. Europe became a memory associated with service, not settlement. For those who attempted to reconnect with resistance helpers, the process was slow and uncertain. International communication was fragmented. Addresses had changed. Records were incomplete. Many resistance participants had used aliases or avoided documentation altogether. Even when names were known, locating someone across national borders proved difficult. Despite these obstacles, documented cases show that some American airmen did return. In the late 1940s, veterans began traveling back to Europe under civilian passports. Others wrote through embassies, veterans organizations, or Red Cross tracing services. These efforts sometimes took years. When reunions occurred, they were often understated. The conditions that had defined their earlier connection, secrecy, urgency, shared risk, were gone. New challenges replaced them. Immigration laws were restrictive. War brides legislation eased entry for some European women, but proof of relationship, financial sponsorship, and medical examinations were required. Cultural adjustment posed additional barriers. Language differences, family expectations, and the memory of occupation shaped decisions on both sides. Not every reunion led to marriage. Some meetings provided closure rather than continuation. In other cases, relationships resumed and endured. Records confirm marriages between American veterans and European women who had assisted resistance networks, including helpers involved in POW escapes. These unions were rarely publicized. Their origins were not always discussed openly, even within families. Silence was common. For many women, speaking openly about resistance work carried risk even after the war. Political divisions, post-war reprisals, and shifting narratives discouraged detailed testimony. Some feared being misunderstood. Others saw no benefit in revisiting years defined by constant danger. American veterans faced their own reluctance. Their wartime experiences were often simplified for public consumption. The complexity of surviving through civilian assistance did not align easily with post-war narratives of military victory. As decades passed, recognition arrived unevenly. Some resistance participants received medals or formal acknowledgments. Others remained anonymous, their contributions recorded only in archives or family recollections. American veterans occasionally spoke of "a woman who helped me," without naming her, honoring privacy over credit. What endured was the outcome: lives saved, futures altered, children born into circumstances that would not have existed without a decision made under occupation. The relationship that began with an act of assistance did not conform to romantic ideals. It was shaped by constraint, risk, and necessity. Its survival into peacetime depended not on heroism, but on persistence. And it left behind a quieter legacy, one that becomes visible only when examined carefully, long after the war's noise has faded. That legacy leads naturally to a broader reflection on what such stories reveal about war itself. The war ended across Europe with formal surrender, yet for those who had survived in the shadows, the end was only partial. Liberation brought freedom from immediate danger, but it did not erase the long months spent in concealment, the constant calculations, or the lives risked to preserve them. For American POWs who had escaped through civilian networks, the world suddenly shifted from survival to reintegration. A world governed by borders, paperwork, and the mundane rhythms of peacetime. For the woman who had guided and protected him, the war's conclusion carried a different weight. Her actions had been illegal under occupation law, punishable by imprisonment or death. Recognition came rarely, and often decades later, if at all. She returned to civilian life, quietly resuming ordinary routines while carrying the memory of choices that had shaped a man's survival. Some reunited with the men they had helped. Historical records confirm cases in which American airmen, aided by European women during their escapes, sought contact after the war through Red Cross tracing services, veterans organizations, or personal travel. In certain instances, reunions led to marriage or long-term correspondence. In others, the distance of time, geography, and circumstance prevented continuation. What these cases share is a truth beyond romance, a bond forged in necessity, resilience, and mutual dependence, a bond that outlasted fear. The story of one American POW and the woman who assisted him illustrates a quiet reality of World War II. Heroism was not always loud. Survival often depended on unseen decisions, on ordinary people willing to act despite extraordinary risk. The airman's life was preserved, not through military strategy alone, but through the courage and discretion of civilians operating under occupation. History remembers battles, losses, and campaigns, but it is also written in moments of silent trust, in decisions made behind walls and barbed wire, in acts whose significance becomes clear only in retrospect. The choices of those who helped and those who relied on help remind us that even in the darkest periods of human conflict, the preservation of life and the human connections formed through it remain some of the most enduring legacies. In this quiet way, the story concludes, not with fanfare, not with spectacle, but with the truth of what survival demanded and the long shadow it cast over lives reshaped by war.